Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and happy Mother's Day weekend. My name is Emily Vandermeer, and I'm a communication specialist with WWF's Nature Connected Communities program. And today I'm going to be your MC for our Maintaining Your Garden webinar. So gardening is something that we can all do right now while we're at home that is good for our mental health, our physical health, and it's also really good for the health of nature. So that is one of the reasons why we started our Garden for Wildlife webinar series. It's our goal to give you the dirt on gardening with native plants so that together we can grow Canada's largest wildlife garden. This is the fourth webinar in our series. Over the past 2 weeks, our experts have talked about how you can plan your native plant garden and also how you can get your hands in the dirt and start actually planting, whether you have a backyard or you're gardening in a small space. So today we are taking that journey one step farther, and we're going to be sharing how you can maintain your native plant garden so that it can help wildlife through the 4 seasons. So we really hope that you will be able to join us for upcoming webinars. You can register for those on wwf.ca. You will see on our homepage a link where you can register. And we are also have a 7th webinar coming up that we're going to be announcing on Monday with Doug Talamy, looking at his new book and the lessons from that. And if you have not been able to join us for some of the past webinar episodes, we do post them on YouTube about 48 hours afterwards, so you can watch all the previous webinars there. So while we were waiting, we took a quick poll of people who had signed in early just to get to know you a little bit better. So we can see here that majority of you live in Ontario. So I think you're going to find a lot of the information we give today really applicable to where we live, which is great. And I can see that we have about 65% of you have come to at least one of our webinars so far, and 34% of you are new. So please do go back and watch some of the previous episodes. I think you'll find them really helpful. And lastly, we asked who here is a member of our In the Zone gardening program, and about half of you are. Great. So in a moment, I'll be introducing you to our experts that we have online today. They are equally excited about native plants and pollinators as you are, and you will have a chance to ask your questions at the end of the presentation. And we really encourage you to put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat. The chat, no one else can see the answers to the questions. With the Q&A, our experts will be answering some of your questions during the presentation, and then everyone can see your answers there. And if you notice one of our experts flag your question as answered live, that means that's a question that they want to address at the end of the presentation for everybody. We will do our best to answer all of your questions, but we know with past webinars, we have had so many questions we haven't been able to. So what we're going to commit to doing is to either do another live Q&A where we get to those questions, or we'll be sending out our answers to those questions with an email at the end of our webinar series. Go ahead here. So I want to say first thank you to Carolinian Canada. They are partnering with us on our In the Zone Gardens program. For those of you who haven't heard of In the Zone or aren't members, it's a community made up of thousands of gardeners across Southern Ontario who are growing native plant habitat. So we know that the loss of habitat is one of the biggest drivers of wildlife loss, and this includes the loss of native plant habitat. So that's a really big challenge for biodiversity and conservation, not only in the Carolinian zone, but across the country. So no matter where you live, we encourage you to help us grow Canada's biggest wildlife garden. I'd also like to give a shout out to Loblaw for their support. They have partnered with us and with local growers to make native plants available for sale in 35 of their locations in Ontario later this month. You can find a list of those locations on inthezonegardens.ca. Okay, now on to the good stuff. Who do we have with us today? So I'm delighted to introduce you to our panelists. First off is Yarmila Beckley. She is part of WWF's Nature Connected Communities team. She manages in the zone, and through her work, she strives to engage Canadians, especially those in urban centers, in actions that help nature. So Yarmila has been with WWF for nearly 23 years, and in this time, she has worked on conservation initiatives like advising Loblaw on their sustainable seafood commitments, as well as managing our long-running Endangered Species Recovery Fund. So Yarmila, do you want to just say hi to everybody who is here today? And I have a question for you. If you can let us know how long you have been gardening with native plants.
Thanks, Emily, and hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and see you all. I'm the newbie in the group. I started about 3 years ago, going into my 4th growing season with native plants. And it's been really gratifying because before that, in my very shady woodland garden type yard, I had a really hard time finding anything that would grow and thrive. And ever since I switched to native plants, it's been a real pleasure to see lots of things growing and thriving, and I'm happy to say I have over 30 species in my yard now.
Thank you, Yarmila. And that's very inspirational for those of us who are new to native plants to know that, in just a few years, you can start growing 30 species.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And we also have Ryan with us. He is our resident botanist, and he's on the board of the North American Native Plant Society. So he is, I would say, a bit of a plant nerd. He would call himself that. So Ryan, how would you describe your garden style?
My garden style is natural. It's wild. It's an experiment. I'm constantly trying to take inspiration from natural places that I've visited, and then I bring them close to me, so I get to experience them every day, and that brings me a whole lot of joy.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And we also have with us Ben Porchuk. He's an ecologist with Carolinian Canada, and he has more than 25 years of experience. So Ben lives in London, Ontario, where his garden boasts, hear this, 200 species of native plants, which is just incredible. With so many different plants, Ben, can you tell us what the most exciting species is that you've seen in your garden this spring?
Sure. Well, thanks, Emily. It's actually not a plant. About 8 years ago, not too far into it, we had a pair of, well, first a single adult screech owl show up. And then I took a picture and I saw another one and I took another picture, and my friend told me, who's a bit of an expert, that they're actually male and female. And within a few weeks, we had 3 owlets that we saw show up. And a couple nights ago, I heard one of these baby owls calling, and it was unmistakable. And so it really feels like they're back. And I'm looking at all the cavities, and it's pretty exciting to have the owls. It kind of drew in all the neighbors, and then it helped them kind of put together all of the different things that made up our garden, which helped attract them. So it's super exciting to have them back.
That is extremely exciting. I love owls. And lastly, we are so excited to have Lorraine Johnson join our panel today to answer your questions. Lorraine is the author of numerous books on native plant gardening, including 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants for Canadian Gardens, and is currently co-writing a book about native plants for native pollinators. She also writes about urban agriculture and growing food in cities, including edible plants. And if you are interested in edible plants, Lorraine will be joining us to give a webinar next Saturday with Ryan on that topic. So please register to learn more. And Lorraine, so everyone can get to know you, I'm wondering, how is your garden doing this year?
Well, considering that we had a deep freeze last night and snow this morning, I'm very happy to report that all of the native plants that are in there that are flowering seem to be doing okay, considering the, just so unusual conditions for this time of year. But as far as my garden goes in general, it's just, I love this time of early spring when you can see that the plants that maybe, you know, the ones I put in last year or the ones that have been in there for a long time, just seeing the way they are spreading and getting bigger and healthier every year and more established. It's just a very invigorating time of year in the native plant garden.
It really is, and it is just so nice how resilient native plants are to our crazy spring weather. And with that, I would just like to pass it over to Yarmila, who is going to get us started today.
Thank you, Emily. Our Garden for Wildlife series has really focused on creating healthy habitat for wildlife where you live by using native plants. And the reason native plants are so important is because they're the plants that have been in that area for thousands of years. They've co-evolved with the wildlife there and formed very special relationships with them. And that helps to really strengthen and make resilient the ecosystems. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to be providing a little bit of more of the context and background and on why native plants are so important. Next slide, please. At WWF, we have been talking about the dual crises of massive biodiversity loss and global climate change, both of which have happened in a relatively short amount of time for us. We also have the added COVID-19 pandemic that's come over the globe in the last few months. And these crises have a profound impact on humans, but they also obviously affect the animals and plants that we share our landscapes with. But we know through science that there are nature-based solutions that can help mitigate those impacts from the crises. And one of the simplest nature-based solutions that we love to talk about is planting native plants. So by putting native habitat back onto our landscape where it belongs by planting native plants, we help to improve biodiversity and as well capture and absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So the restoration of fragmented and degraded habitats through native plants really is an opportunity to bring back the balance in our landscapes. And we like to call this growing Canada's biggest wildlife garden. And we certainly invite all of you to join us. Next slide, please. Canada is a big country, and we have quite a few terrestrial ecozones. There are 7 in the southern part of Canada that stretch from coast to coast. And this is where over 90% of Canadians live. Through this presentation, we'll drill down a little bit more into the orange colored ecozone at the bottom, the mixed wood plains, which includes the Carolinian zone. But really the idea of using native plants to create better habitat for wildlife and people is applicable everywhere. Next slide, please. Southern Ontario's Carolinian zone. This is really Canada's biodiversity hotspot. We have the highest number of different plants and animals than anywhere else in Canada. We also have about a third of Canadian species at risk here. And you'll notice that when you compare it to the map before, it's actually a really, really small part of Canada. It's less than 1% of our land mass. Yet at the same time, 25% of Canadians live here. And so you can imagine what kind of pressure that puts on the immense biodiversity that we have here. And the Carolinian zone itself, it's actually the northern part of a special assemblage of species that actually occur in the US, in the Carolinas, and reach up into southern Ontario and provide us with this wonderful Carolinian habitat that we enjoy here. So the challenge in the Carolinian zone, The green spots that you can see, and I should say on this map, the Carolinian zone is delineated by the squiggly line sort of going through the middle of the map. And the green areas are federally and provincially protected areas, mostly conservation areas, parks, and as well as some First Nations lands. But the challenge here is that that really is only 15% of good quality habitat cover. And really from an ecological point of view, we need at least 30% to have viable and functioning ecosystems. Now, the additional challenge in the Carolinian zone, of course, is that 95% of the land is privately owned. And so this is where you and I can make a huge difference as people who have land that we take care of and can really bring along and restore habitat on. Next slide, please. So to meet this challenge in the Carolinian zone, as Emily mentioned, WWF joined with our colleagues at Canada a few years back to create In the Zone. And it's a program that we've created to help guide people with a number of different tools to create healthy habitat on their property, whether it's a backyard, front yard, balcony garden, what have you. Everyone can join and help create that healthy habitat. And during the 3 years, we've actually been tracking the progress that's been made through our online tool called the Garden Tracker. And we can see a lot of great information from here. This is just a quick snapshot of some things that we've learned over the years. So we now have actually over 5,000 people who have joined to help grow Canada's biggest wildlife garden. And we know that In the Zone participants collectively manage 28,000 hectares of land. And on that land, we have nearly 61,000 native plants. So that's really tremendous, and we're really excited. And as the program grows and the years go by, we'll see more and more of the impact that everybody's actions have. Next slide, please. So we talked about what native plants are and the special relationships they have with the wildlife around them, but there are many other benefits, obviously, of them to us as people who garden. Because of the way that they're so well adapted to local conditions, they actually really don't need any pesticide, herbicide, or fertilizer inputs. And same for watering. Many of these plants have developed really deep root systems that allow them to survive really hot drought conditions that occur in southern Ontario, for example. And so this translates into cost savings and, of course, less maintenance. And for somebody like me who really came into gardening through the native plants lens, I'm actually quite a lazy gardener, and the low maintenance part appeals to me quite a bit. So we also have other benefits, including better shade from trees and shrubs, water retention after really significant and high flow water events. Again, more biomass to soak up that water rather than having it flow straight into the sewer system. Native plants will increase carbon storage, of course, support biodiversity, and help create those resilient ecosystems that we need right now. But and especially at this time of year, or this year, with the pandemic, I think that really the emotional and well-being aspect of gardening and being outside and nurturing something and seeing other wildlife take advantage of that is really gratifying. Next slide, please. So this amazing creature is the curve-lined owlet caterpillar. It was taken by Doug Ptolemy. As Emily mentioned, he's a well-known entomologist and huge native plants champion. And the reason we've added this slide is really to remind us all that more than ever we need nature. It's insects like these in the lower parts of food chains that are truly in steep decline, and these food chains underpin the complex food webs that humans rely on. So we can really support these amazing critters by ensuring that the native plants that they rely on for food and reproduction can be found in habitats. Next slide, please. Right, so this is one of my favorite parts about In the Zone and planting with native plants, and that is simply that you plant it and they will come. A couple of years ago, we were creating a native plant garden down in Windsor, and it was truly just surrounded by asphalt, concrete, and turf. And maybe one lone tree was there as well. But we started planting some wetland species next to a drainage ditch, cover, and within literally minutes of that plant going into the ground, a beautiful dragonfly came down and sat on it and just spent some time there with us, and we were all amazed at how did it know that plant was there. And that's really the amazing thing, is that you plant it and the species will come. Next slide, please. The other great thing that I really love about In the Zone is that it's for everyone, no matter what your situation is in terms of whether you have a rooftop or balcony garden, even a boulevard, or you're renovating your home and want to get rid of your driveway and convert it into a garden. This is a perfect activity for you. It's not just for the people in, a suburb who have a typical backyard. It's for everybody. Anywhere where you can plant a plant, you can plant a native plant, and it's going to make a difference. Next slide, please. Okay, so on to the meat of our presentation today. We're going to walk you through 6 different aspects to maintaining your habitat: weeding, watering, mulching and leaves, moving plants, maintaining the look that you've achieved, and then monitoring and recording. So I'm going to hand this over to Ryan now. Thank you.
Thanks, Yarmila. That's great. Some of you may have heard some of that context before if you've watched some of the previous webinars, but we think it's really important to reinforce that point of why we're talking about native plants, so it bears repeating. All right, I wanted to set up this structure by talking about the 4 Seasons of Wildlife Gardening guide that was actually one of the first projects that I started helping with last year. You can find this guide, the digital version of it, on the In the Zone website. Just scroll to about halfway down the page and you'll see a digital version available to download. And this guide is really meant to help remind people of the key maintenance activities for a wildlife garden throughout the year. And what you'll see on here are some familiar terms and some things that are missing, which the things that are not here are actually kind of just as important as the things that are. So you won't find mowing the lawn, for example. You won't find deadheading your plants, for example, because we don't actually advocate for those things. But weeding is one of the things that we do advocate for, but we've taken a sort of a different spin on it. And I wanted to say that weeding and native plants have an interesting history to them. And so before getting into it, I wanted to ask a question of everybody. So we've got a poll set up. I want to know which of the following words do you think is synonymous with a weed? And then I also would like to know whether you think goldenrod causes allergies. So if you would please answer those questions for me, I would like to know. I would like to know. Indeed, indeed. Let's see what people think about this. Okay. Let's get those results up. What does everyone think about weeds? The definition of a weed. Interesting to know. Emily, can we get those results up? I'm very curious. Okay. Wow. All right. Okay. Okay. Very cool. So you guys, 60% of you got the answer right. It's actually, there's no fixed botanical definition of what a weed is. It's just any plant that you don't want to be there. And that's context dependent, right? So some things may be a plant, a nice plant in one context and a weed in another. So you guys are really smart. Okay, invasive plants, I threw that in as a little bit of a red herring there. So it's true that invasive plants are types of weeds, but not all weeds are invasive plants. So that was a little bit tricky. And you guys are so smart. Oh my gosh, you know the goldenrod does not cause allergies, even though it's on the bottle of a lot of allergy medications. Yeah, in fact, goldenrod evidently is not a wind pollinated plant actually, like ragweed, which blooms at the same time, but most people don't notice it, and that does cause allergies. So, but y'all are great. Okay, so I know who I'm talking to here. Um, Evidently, in the past, there's been some confusion. A lot of people tend to think that weeds are the same thing as native plants, and that all native plants are weedy, but that's not actually true. In fact, only a very few number of native plants spread rapidly or have noxious or undesirable properties. And in fact, most plants that a lot of people would call weeds are not native plants. They're actually Eurasian imports. So thanks for getting on the same page with me there. Here you can see some materials that are actually useful broadly for lots of different gardening activities. Up top, this is for a more sort of typical larger garden. And down below, those are my tools that I use in my little balcony garden. You may have seen if you came to episode 3, the previous ones. So it's good to have a good kit. Shall we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so all of that about weeding is just to say, to me, the most important thing is that you know the plants that are growing in your garden. And you can't really tell whether it's a weed or not if you don't know what it is. So we advocate that you should figure out what those little things are. Wait until they have some characteristics that are identifiable, and then you can figure it out. And you can learn whether that's garlic mustard or creeping bellflower, or is it actually a baby New England aster that you didn't even know was going to show up in your garden, but there it is, and you got a free plant right there. So just always be a little bit cautious. And when you do weed, you can use those pulled up little weeds as a form of green mulch. If it turns out that that's not a terrible invasive species that's going to spread all over the place, you can just toss it down on the ground. It'll dry out and contribute to fertilizing your ground. Next slide, please. Invasive plants evidently are a big problem. If you have something like this periwinkle here, Vinca minor, I do not envy you. I know it looks pretty and lots of people put it in because it covers the ground, it sure does, but these plants have a tendency to spread not only in your garden, but they'll creep under fences to the next neighbor's garden, and their seeds and propagules can spread into natural areas, which is very problematic. So one way of dealing with it that you can see, this is from Pete's backyard here, is to clear an area, and then in the center here, he's actually taken bathroom tiles and stuck them vertically into the ground to create a wall that goes below ground to prevent those creeping rhizomes from coming back over and taking over his lovely woodland garden with trout lilies there. And then annually you can sort of clear a new area, move the front a little bit further, and that's how you do battle with certain creeping invasive species. Next slide, please. And I did mention that there are a few native plants that do spread very quickly. So cut plant would be one of those. Canada goldenrod is one of those. Of course, there's dozens of species of goldenrod, many of which are actually adorable and self-contained. But if you have those plants and if you want to keep them, and you live in a small garden context, what I recommend is actually just grow them in containers. You could do a large container like the ones that I use on my balcony, keep them above ground, keep them well watered, and then maybe consider when they're flowering, you can chop those flowers off, make a pretty bouquet, and that way they're not going to spread into your neighbors and go crazy all over the place. That's one way to deal with it. And also don't forget that certain weedy plants, including mint and garlic mustard, for example, when you're pulling those up, that's food. You could eat that, so it serves a purpose too. Next slide, please. Watering. I'll pass that over to Ben.
Thanks, Ryan, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's great to be here with these panelists. And just a reminder that if you are outside of the Carolinian zone, don't worry at all. A lot of the things here apply for gardening pretty much wherever you are. We just happened to start this program here. So if you are actually looking at maintaining your garden, then one of the key things to do is to collect rainwater. You may as well collect it if it's coming off your roof. And there are a few ways that we can do it that are a little more effective in terms of filtering it. And you can see that on the left-hand side, they're actually in the middle. There's a screen there that will help filter the water, but also help prevent things like mosquitoes getting in and laying eggs. They like standing water. And there are often a lot of questions and concerns around mosquitoes for a good reason. You want to be comfortable. And if you look at the bottom right there, there's an option of collecting rainwater where it's giving access to standing water for mosquitoes. So you just want to do it right. If you're going to put the effort in, go all out and make sure it's done well. Go ahead, Emily, next slide. Yeah, and what we're looking at here is different types of ways that we can water. And the one on the left is directly putting water onto the roots of something like purple coneflower. And that's a nice plant as an example here, because certainly to establish it, water would be great. Once it's established, because it falls in the prairie ecosystem, we really don't need to water this plant at all. It gets quite deep roots. And if you look on the right-hand side of the slide here, this is watering. It looks like midday, and it's sprinkling. It's going onto the leaves, so it's subject to evaporation and not getting directly where we want it to go. So again, if we're going to put in the effort, do it well, and you'll see results pretty well, and have to do less effort. Next slide. So there are different types of wetlands, right? We went over this in a couple of the previous webinars. If we've got a big pond on the left, this water will be here for a while. It's quite a volume, but it will eventually sink down and we will lose it to evaporation, especially if we have things like waterfall or flowing water. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a little area on the ground that's for bees or birds that are on the ground. This would need to be filled up pretty frequently because it's shallow. It gives them access to many different layers, things like bees and other insects that would come in and certainly take a drink. So we have to be aware that if we're creating something, then we are the ones kind of in charge to maintain it. It's like setting up a bird feeder if you're going to choose to do that, and then stopping midway through the winter, and the birds can't really go anywhere else. So we really have to make the choice to keep it up and be consistent. Next slide. And larger systems like this, we've seen this one. This is the early days of my really big backyard system where it's almost complete. We put this in there to show you there are different elements. If you're choosing to take on a big project, and this is a system of 1, 2, 3, 4 different wetlands joined together working in a way that has to be engineered. Every spring, especially after the winter, after things like dogs and raccoons and skunks have been playing in there, and now chipmunks I'm dealing with, we have to tinker a little bit. And if you look at the center part of the slide where I now have a lot of rocks and pretty vigorous waterfall that gives off a beautiful sound, I highly recommend you fumbling through this for 3 or 4 years, which is what it took me. But again, just a reminder that you will have to be conscious of the water levels because you lose a lot to evaporation, especially during the summertime when it's really warm and you're outside and you have that waterfall running. And so a part of this covers the the initial thing is that we really want to plan it well so the edges don't get super exposed if you go away and lose a bit of water. Next slide. Mulching and leaves. One of the amazing things that trees do for us is that they reach down deep into the horizon of the soil layers, way deep down where a lot of nutrients are and minerals are stuck for centuries, thousands of years. The trees will pull them up, and as a service, they drop them onto the surface where they are now access to things like worms, all sorts of invertebrates, insects, everything. And to have this golden layer on the top is an amazing thing to take advantage of. I will often go heavily when I rake the area that I maintain as lawn, because we have a family and still like to enjoy it. I'll put it thicker on the margins where I have native plant gardens. And actually the earthworms, which aren't actually native in Southern Ontario, will chew through a really good bunch of these twigs and leaves before summer even comes. So it's really nice to have this cover. It prevents a lot of undesired plants, which are formerly known as weeds. Thank you very much, Ryan. Undesired plants from coming up and save us on the effort. And then things like mulch, which could be wood chips or any other combination of organic matter. It's nice to thicken up the soil in between the plants, because often if you put it right on the plants, it really actually hampers their growth as well, but certainly prevents the growth of non-desired plants. And it's a good annual thing to do. I tend to just use leaves and then have wood chips and mulch for the pathways. But sometimes when I want to show that a native plant garden can look a little more manicured, I will put it in between the plants, because now my native plants are super happy and they're multiplying in big numbers. Next slide. Okay, so you'll have a lot of plants that come up, and our tendency is to want to take those stems off as soon as the flowers drop. And I understand having things look neat, and yet sometimes in nature you'll see some areas that are seemingly to us messy. But a lot of things like bees and other Hymenoptera, which are wasps and all sorts of things, even caterpillar pupa, these insects will overwinter right inside of the stems. Even sometimes ants will. And you might think, oh, I don't want ants, but ants are pretty critical in the garden, helping us plant a lot of our native plants and feeding on some of the seeds, but not killing them and then redistributing them throughout the garden. So it's pretty critical to leave these stems at least halfway. I tend to leave them up really high because some of my plants I want to collect seeds and redistribute them. And things like, for example, gray-headed coneflower, I left them up tall, thinking I would collect the seeds. And I went out to collect them in October to find 10 goldfinches, little tiny, beautiful birds feeding on my seeds. And so, of course, I did a quick detour and I came back a few days later and they had eaten pretty much all the seeds. So it's critical that we leave these things for wildlife to help recover. It also gives an amazing structure for our garden. And if you want later in the spring, when everything has emerged, you can clean it up. Next slide. Okay, I'm passing it off here.
Moving plants. Oh, can we go back to that previous one? That I just want to explain this image briefly. This is me. This is my way of moving plants with a wagon. So this is not the typical way of moving plants, but last year I decided to transplant some of my container garden species from my balcony into my community garden plot. And so I actually physically moved them in this way, which is not the normal way to do it, but I thought it'd be fun to share that. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of different reasons why you might want to move plants around. One is that you might have such an abundance of, for example, bloodroot taking over an area that you want to share some of that or split it and send it to another side of your garden. Another reason is that maybe you found that the spot where you planted didn't have the perfect growing conditions, whether that was something in the soil that you didn't realize was there, or a moisture issue, or you just didn't fully understand the needs of that plant. Or possibly the ecology of that space actually changed. So maybe a big limb came down on a tree, or a building went up, and that changed the light availability in that area. So for any of these reasons, and probably more, you might want to move plants from one spot to another. This can definitely be done. Is best done in the spring or the fall when soil is moist. And it is, I have to say, the word transplant is appropriate here because it is a fairly traumatic procedure that should be done with care and planning. So really what you should do is always consider that exposed roots are not a good thing, and you want to keep those roots um, in the soil for as long as possible and out of the soil for as little time as possible. And when they're out, keep them moist. So you really are on the clock. It's not like you have seconds or minutes, but do try to get it from one spot into its new home within, I'm gonna say, an hour. That's what you've got, okay? If it's sunny and dry out, maybe less. And take a big chunk of soil too. So do, you know, that soil is gold there. You've got all kinds of good stuff in there. So dig deeper than you think you need to and a little wider than you think you need to as well. And finally, if you don't have a place to put it immediately, a container is another good option for this. You might be able to sort of temporarily house your transplanted section in a container filled with soil, again, like fully enclosed so those roots aren't exposed to air, and of course always thoroughly watered to keep those roots moist. Next slide, please. The other thing to consider is during the establishment phase, it is possible. You should not feel discouraged if there's some mortality. So you may get something like 10%, maybe even 15% of plants that don't make it through the first year. There are a bunch of reasons for this. Maybe that you didn't choose exactly the right plant for the right place. It may be that it was just a really tough year for establishment due to wild temperature swings or drought or whatever. Not to worry, it's nothing to be embarrassed about, but you should consider and learn from those plants that perished in the first year. This is where your record keeping will come in. Figure out, did the trout lilies work really well in the south part of your garden, but not so well in the north part of your garden? There's a pattern there. Maybe there's something that you can learn, and in replacing, choose, am I going to replace with exactly the same plants, or am I going to try a different species, or am I going to work with the ones that survived really well? So there's a lot of information you can learn when you're doing those replacements. Next slide, please. Just your regular old plug here for our garden guides, which have all of this information and much more. They're really a super valuable resource. All you got to do is head to inthezonegardens.ca, make a quick account. It takes about 30 seconds, and you'll have access to these for free. Also great for people who are new to this and maybe don't know quite as much as you, brilliant and extraordinary individuals today. Next slide, please. Okay, we're moving into the look. So here I have a picture of my garden that I helped design for my condo area. And in thinking about this garden, I really considered the people who were going to be using it and looking at it. And I intentionally made it a little bit more manicured, a little bit more, and I used species that were easily recognizable because I wanted people to feel like this was their garden too. So that's sort of what we're talking about here. And in terms of the look, there's lots and lots of options. You can do almost any kind of look with native plants. It's just a matter of how you're going to do it. I do have a question, another poll for the audience. I'm very curious to know what your garden style is. So we're going to put up one more poll and just see which of these words do you identify with? Do you recognize, and I threw in an interesting one here, wabi sabi. If you don't know that term, I would encourage you to look it up afterwards. It's an interesting philosophy that I think really jives with what we're talking here, but from the other side of the world. It's a Japanese and Buddhist philosophy and design concept. So let's see, which of these do people feel is a good description of their garden style? I am very curious to know. My personal one I mentioned earlier is probably more on the wild side of things. I like things that just remind me of natural places, and that's fine, but it's not the only way that you can do a native plant garden by any means. Okay, let's see what people think about this. Okay, all right, interesting. So we've got, oh wow, we got 7% of people that are using the word wabi-sabi to describe their style. That is amazing. Non-existent style, I love. And not too surprising that we only have 2% of people describing their gardens as formal. And that's okay. That's fine by me. Most people are saying a wild garden like mine, or that's pretty much tied with a cottage garden, which I think is a good style too. Very, very much compatible with habitat for sure. Thanks very much for that. That was very interesting to know. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here we have some neighborhoods. And what I wanted to talk about here is kind of thinking about being a good neighbor and maybe how you might think of your front yard as different from your backyard. So your backyard is really for you. It's just your own thing. You could do whatever you want there. But what I wanted to say about the front yard is it is polite. You're being a good neighbor if you sort of look around, see what other people are doing with their gardens, and maybe you consider doing something a little bit differently to take into account the fact that these people, you're trying to create a neighborly look. So, for example, my brother and sister-in-law live on a street where people leave the dandelions. Nobody pulls the dandelions, and so they leave the dandelions too, and that's cool. That works out. Um, if you're on a street where everybody meticulously pulls all the dandelions and you're the only one with a lawn full of dandelions, just consider that may draw some attention, and you want to be ready to explain why it is that you're doing that. Signage helps very much in this regard. And the other thing I wanted to say here is, for those people who do like a more formal look, you can totally do that. You can have straight lines, you can have trimmed hedges made out of native plants. It's just purely a matter of effort. So as anybody knows who has tidied a home, over time things tend to get chaotic, and it takes effort and time and just work to put things into an orderly state. And if you want to do that with a native plant garden, you totally can. But you can also put in less work and let things go, a little bit more wild. And that turns out to be a good way to do it with a habitat garden to, not disturb the wildlife that's living in there. In terms of structure, you know, it's good to incorporate elements that you would find in nature, like wood, for example, or stones, hummocks and hollows, some elevation changes. Um, it's good, if you have a meadow garden, maybe you want to consider replicating that feel of a meadow that has um, drifts of clusters of maybe just one or two species in one particular area. That's the kind of thing that you can do to create an interesting structure. And of course, for a woodland, what comes to mind for me are layers. So you've got the ground layer, the shrub layer, the subcanopy, the canopy. And it's really, I think you benefit by using those kinds of structures that exist in nature and taking inspiration from those. Next slide, please. I did want to mention the possibility for fusion gardens, which is the next slide here. So fusion gardens, this is a terminology that's been used in a lot of different contexts, but here in particular, I'm talking about a garden that is simultaneously a habitat garden and a food garden. It turns out these two styles work really, really well together. The reason being that pollinators are magnetically attracted to native plants, and those same pollinators are what you need to get a bumper crop out of your food garden. So these two types of gardening, I find, go hand in hand. They work super, super well together. I do that in my community garden plot, and I have to say my plot is the favorite of all of the pollinators, which may be a little bit selfish, but you know, if everybody else planted native plants, maybe they would spread themselves around a little bit more. And we have some pictures of non-native plants here. No need to cringe, folks. We are aware that Narcissus and Hyacinthus are non-native, but these are plants that, you know, they're fairly well behaved. And for the color that they add, for the familiarity that they add to a garden, we feel that you can get along with this kind of thing. It's okay. Yes, occasionally a squirrel will dig one of these up and plant it in a forest. But I've never seen these things spreading like mad. So if you consider, you know, what these plants have the potential to do and whether they're dangerous or not dangerous, you can play around with a variety of different options in a fusion garden, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to monitoring and recording. That is Yarmila, I believe.
Thank you, Ryan. After spending some time planting and growing and maintaining your garden, you'll start to notice that things change. You'll notice the plants that are doing really well, and you'll notice the ones that don't come back after a growing season. And that's totally fine and normal. Every garden is different, and the conditions are unique to it. So over time, you'll find which plants work best for you, and you'll be able to adjust your plan accordingly. So the key, though, is to take notice and record the changes that you're seeing. Notice the plants that are doing well and not so well. Notice all the different critters that are showing up, the birds, the bees, the butterflies. And also, make note of all the other things that you've done to improve habitat, whether it's about adding a water feature or adding a twig pile for more habitat. And so what all this does is gives you information about how to go forward with your garden. And you can record this electronically in a notebook, or my favorite way is just taking lots of pictures, and then you can compare those year after year and see what's changed in your garden. Of course, the garden tracker through In the Zone is a great way to take note of all those changes, because everything that you add or see in your garden can be recorded there as well. Next slide, please. So there are lots of tools to help you with your monitoring and recording. The binoculars you saw in the previous slide, a macro lens for your camera so that you can take some amazing close-up pictures, and of course the indispensable ID guides and field guides that will help you identify the neat new things that are coming into your yard as you begin to add more native plants. Next slide, please. So we do get asked questions about a number of other things, including bee homes and bee motels, specifically the one that you can see in the top left corner of your screen. And while very well intentioned, there has been actually some research coming out of the Toronto area recently that shows that these bee motels are actually more beneficial to wasps and spiders and non-native bees than are native bees under certain conditions. So more research is needed on this, and while the jury is out on that, our recommendation is just to provide natural habitat. Leave some bare ground in your garden for those ground-dwelling bees, and add some log and twig piles for extra habitat. Next slide, please. And of course, another favorite in the garden are birds. People love to watch them come visit their bird feeders or bird baths. We're not the only ones, as you can see by the picture in the middle. Cats are very fond of bird watching too, and I'm sure most of you know that they have a great impact on bird mortality. So please keep your cats indoors, especially during migration season. And if you have windows that are highly reflective and can lead to bird strikes, you can add some dotted film to it to reduce that reflectivity and prevent those bird strikes. But again, just in terms of providing food for birds, we'd also highly encourage you to grow those native plants that provide the food that birds are looking for. The berries, the seeds, and those insects that they need can all be provided by planting native plants in your yard. Next slide, please. So circling back to the garden tracker again, there's lots of information that we gather through the tracker. People are sharing all sorts of things about their gardens. We've learned that 1/3 of gardens already include native plants, which is great, but it also shows us there's lots of room to grow. We know that 91% of gardeners feel connected to nature and plan to grow more native plants because they know that that's the best thing for the wildlife in their area. And we also have found that 68% of gardens within the zone program are connected to adjacent habitat, which is really important, especially in highly urbanized and dense areas where green space is much needed for wildlife to make their way and find their food safely. Next slide, please. So we're near the end of our presentation. Here's just a quick summary page again of all the things that we've walked you through. We hope you've learned something. And just a quick note that as the wheel diagram that Ryan shared earlier shows, really gardening is all year round. And even if you're not weeding and watering, then certainly in the winter you can be monitoring and recording the changes in your garden. So there's always something to do. Next slide, please. Over the next 2 slides, we've gathered some of our favorite resources. This one is some of the books that we rely on and have enjoyed reading. They're available, this list is available on our website, and really the content there is for everybody right across the country. It's not just folks in the Carolinian zone. Next slide, please. Similarly for these websites, these are some of our favorite go-to sites that have really interesting and detailed information about species identification and growing conditions, anything that you really want to know about native plants. Next slide, please. And finally, again, just invite all of those who are not part of In the Zone, please visit our website, see what it's all about, and register your garden, grow with us to create Canada's biggest wildlife garden. Even if you're not in the Carolinian zone, we welcome everyone. Thank you, and I think I'm passing it off to Emily now.
Yes, thank you so much, Yarmila, and everyone for staying on the line with us. If you have some questions that you'd like to reach out to our experts personally, we have their email addresses on the screen here. And of course, you can contact us through the In the Zone website as well. We have our upcoming webinars. We have one happening on Tuesday that is looking at monitoring and citizen science into a little bit more depth. And then again, next Saturday, looking at edible plants with Lorraine and Ryan. So with that, I'd like to get into some of your questions. We have been answering them live, and during the presentation, we just have some more. And Lorraine, as our guest panelist, are there any questions that stood out to you that you'd like to have dibs on answering?
Yeah, I'd love to answer a question that Sandy Gillian's asked. I hope I've pronounced your name properly. And it's one that I hear all the time. People ask what to plant under a Norway maple, because Norway maples create really tough conditions. They dry out the soil, so they steal. So Norway maple is a non-native tree. It's quite invasive. It will reseed like crazy, and it dries out the soil, and it takes nutrients from the soil. But there are some native plants that I have found in my experience that do really well underneath Norway maples, and those includes native woodland plants like Solomon's seal does very well, like wild ginger, like foam flower. You could try the woodland strawberry. What you could also do is without adding too much soil, certainly try to increase the organic matter in the soil under there. So definitely mulch with dead leaves in the fall and leave those dead leaves on the soil over the spring. They will slowly be taken into the soil and replenish the soil. They'll have disappeared by June. Anyway, hope those are helpful suggestions.
Right, thank you so much, Lorraine. And there's another question here from you by Janine Harris, who says that they notice none of the Toronto proper loblaws have native plants. Is that something that may be coming, and where else in the city can people find native plants?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that the city being talked about was Toronto. And if that's the case, someone else from In the Zone, perhaps Ben or Ryan or Yarmila, can speak about the Loblaws situation with native plants. But as far, there's a specialty native plant nursery in Toronto down at the Brickworks that Evergreen runs. So it's native plants available right downtown.
Emily, I can answer a little bit about the Loblaw situation. And because this is a pilot year, we were limited in the number of stores that we were able to have the plants in. So what you see on our website listed there is the number of the locations of the stores that will be carrying native plants this year, but hopefully we'll be able to make that grow for next year.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question here for Ben asking, what percentage of the Carolinian Zone private lands are commercial?
Oh, right. Yeah. I did click that I would take this one, and it would be only really, you know, a best guess. I did answer two of the questions in there that 30% of the Carolinian Zone is about 12,000 hectares. And there was another question about how much of a percentage of the Carolinian Zone is 29,000 hectares, and that is 70% for those of you who asked those questions. I work with larger landowners in Southern Ontario and all of these southern counties here. And to me, I would say the percentage, because the Carolinian Zone going from Toronto all the way down to Windsor and then up to Grand Bend and then across again. There are some pretty big cities in there, but of course, a lot of it is farmland. Some of the counties like Norfolk County have close to 30%. And of course, a lot of our First Nations communities account for most of our natural habitat that remains. So we are so grateful for our First Nations partners. So outside of those areas, you know, it's upwards of 90%. In farmland and development areas.
Great, thanks, Ben. That was a lot of numbers, but you know your stuff. I have a question now for Ryan from Sandy, who says, my garden has about 50 to 60% native plants. The rest are showy non-invasives. Are we advocating for 100% native gardens, or is a combination acceptable?
Yeah, I love this question, which is why I flagged it. Sandy, it was Sandy, right? Yes, Sandy. Okay, thank you for bringing this up. It's a great question, and I guess the answer is really going to be different for every individual person, and we think that that's totally fine. At In the Zone, we are advocating. We want this to be an open thing available to just about anyone. So even one native plant being added to a garden is better than nothing. But you know, the more native plants you have, the more viable that is for higher biodiversity of species. So where you're going to create that cutoff, I think really depends. You know, if you're doing a fusion garden where you're planting a lot of food, and you're like food is a main purpose of your garden, then it is totally sensible for me to have 30, 40, 50%, even more of the garden be dedicated to those food plants. That's really important to you, evidently, in that context. But wherever you can spare the space and wherever you think you can sneak more native plants in, I say go for it. And if you do end up getting up to 100%, you know, you can give yourself a huge pat on the back, and I'm sure that the the wildlife and pollinators will love you for it. So it really is a personal thing, I would say.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. I have another question here. This one is from Linda, who says they have a hedge of cedar trees in their yard. Should I remove some or all of the leaves underneath them in the spring?
Can I answer that one?
Yes, go for
Yeah.
it.
I think it's great to leave all the leaves on any kind of garden bed over, leave the leaves over the winter, and in the spring, they're just going to be brought into the soil by worms. As for plants to plant under a cedar hedge, there are so many of the natives, like any of the woodland natives would be good under there, especially ones that can take a little bit of acidic conditions like sharp-lobed hepatica and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. Yarmila, this question is for you. Do we have in the zone signage that we can give people to put in their gardens?
Thanks, Emily. I was actually in the process of just replying to that
Wow.
one. Yes, we do. We give signs to everyone who fills out the garden tracker and registers their garden within the zone. So we do have those. And if you're interested, you can contact us at our contact@inthezonegardens.ca email, and we can arrange it.
Awesome. Thank you, Yarmila. I have a question from Simon asking that they're having trouble containing smooth rose and winged sumac. They saw Ryan's cloth bag solution, but they're not sure if that would work. I can't pronounce this word exactly. Rhizomes in the soil.
The rhizomes,
The
rhizomes.
rhizomes. What can Simon do?
Okay, Simon, great question. I haven't really tried any super aggressive rhizomatous pointy things in those bags, but I'll tell you it's pretty tough material. So maybe try it above ground first with some of those pointy guys and see if they're poking the edges. And if it's working out, maybe you can plant it. You could also reinforce the inside or the outside by putting in a layer of thick plastic, perhaps, or an extra layer of landscaping fabric. Yeah, those are all options. So it's a good idea, though. I think it's a good one.
Great, thank you. And I know Ben and Lorraine, you both saw questions come in that you would like to answer.
Yes, there was one that someone was asking for a native vine. Alex, you were asking for a native vine for a north-facing pergola. Now, one of my absolute favorite native vines is a clematis, actually, a native clematis. It sometimes goes by the common name of old man's beard, and sometimes goes by the name of virgin's bower. But it's a clematis, and I think it's Virginiana is the Latin. And it's fabulous because it can take, it's very adaptable to conditions. Like it can take part shade, part sun, full sun, and it's very prolific. It grows quickly. Some people find it a bit too aggressive, but it has beautiful white flowers in the early summer, and then these beautiful wispy seed heads later on in the summer. It's a fantastic native vine. And
Great,
Ben, I think you were putting up your hand earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Lorraine. It doesn't surprise me you would notice. So I was going to tackle, and feel free for you guys to step in as well, tackle the challenge of what do we do about lawn alternatives, right? Because in North America, it has been identified as the most extensive and widely planted invasive species is the lawn grass. A lot of it is Kentucky bluegrass, which is from Asia. And a lot of us like lawns, even if we like, native plants. I mean, lawns, you can do so many beautiful things on them. They're comfortable. And some people are really fastidious about making sure they have nothing but lawn grass there. And of course, it's a challenge because most of our land in North America is taken up for lawns. It's the #1 crop in the US, for example. And it's a challenge because it has very shallow roots, so they don't really do much for the environment. Their erosion happens quickly because the soil isn't held very well. Some alternatives that I would say that some of you might say, what? But if you can mow your grass or get to some of these plants before they go to seed, for example, dandelions, a lot of people really fight them, and there's like a whole industry in the hardware section that's specifically for dandelions. We actually have one native species in Ontario, and I invite you, if you haven't, this would be a forest therapy moment, to the first dandelion that comes up, just stare into the eyes of the dandelion and look at the different colors that you can see. Some things, we often take these things for granted, and I'm not suggesting that you have a lot of dandelions, but of course, the leaves are edible, parts of the roots are edible. So it's actually quite not a bad plant at all. It's just that it reproduces so prolifically. And so if you can leave a few of those in, they're actually not bad for the soil either, and prevent them from going fully to seed, which is a challenge because they do grow pretty quickly. But other things like plantain, we do have a native species of plantain, and also an English one as well. Someone mentioned thyme, somebody who had asked this question. I recently saw in Aurelia an entire lawn that was out of thyme, nothing but thyme. It was beautiful. You could walk on it, it was in flower. A lot of these things will expand, just like our lawn grass will. And when it expands into natural areas, it becomes very problematic. So the lawn issue is huge. We all love them, we all hate them. I would encourage you to have as many different herbs, so other different species growing in your lawn as possible, and just make sure that you mow them before they all go to seed, or certainly if you're living near a natural area, don't have anything that would jump over and skip into that natural area, impacting the plants that we have there.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. We have a question from Milkweed, which great name, by the way, asking what kind of natural bulbs bloom in spring in Southern Ontario. Lorraine, do you want to take that one?
I did want to take it because it's one of my just favorite things to see, and we can see them right now, is all of the spring, the native bulbs that have just started to bloom. So my favorites, and the ones I would highly recommend, as long as you get them from a reputable nursery, a native plant nursery that hasn't dug them from the wild, would be the trilliums, the jack-in-the-pulpits, and the Virginia bluebells. Those are three of the most beautiful native to Ontario spring bulbs that I would highly recommend.
Great, thank you. And we've had a few questions come in about what people can do to prevent bird strikes, and specifically where they can get the dotted film for their windows. Yermila, is that something you can answer?
Sure. I actually personally have never used that film because I don't thankfully have bird strikes, but I know that they are available. I would recommend that you check out the FLAP website, the Fatal Light Awareness Program. They would have all the resources for this particular issue that you'd be looking for.
Great, thank you so much for that answer, Yermila. Just looking through the questions now, we have a question from Sandy asking, wild grape, should it be left to climb mature trees, or should we pull it down?
Can I take it? Okay.
Okay.
Oh no,
Everybody
Ben,
wants this one.
And does everyone?
Okay, Ben, go. Ben, it's you.
I'll just say really quickly that they co-evolve together, so they don't tend to kill the tree, but in some cases they do, but there are other issues happening for the tree. They also provide habitat, but I will pass it over.
Right. So just what I wanted to say about wild grape is knowing its ecology is important to understanding how it spreads. So wild grape you almost always find it growing right on the edge of a forest, where you're sort of transitioning from a wooded area to an open area. And it doesn't really spread much beyond that. It's not likely to go way into the open area or way into the forest. But it does have a tendency to form like a dense wall of beautiful leaves, which actually turn a lovely kind of color in the fall, produces a food source, an edible grape, and lots of flowers that bees love. So if you don't mind having that look, almost like the English ivy type look, I say leave it, keep it, love it, go for it.
And I guess all I was going to say was, but keep an eye on it just to make sure that nothing bad starts happening to that tree.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question. This one is about morning star sedge grass seeds. If they were kept outdoors in the winter, do I still need to cold moist stratify them before planting? Ryan, I feel like this one might be up your alley.
Okay, I do a lot of stratification. I saw in your comment that it looks like you had done research and saw that that particular species requires at least 2 months. If they've been outside and they were cold and moist for the winter time, that should have done the trick. That usually does do it. Often when I'm feeling a little lazy with my seeds, I'll just toss them out in the fall and let them naturally cold moist stratify. And then they come up all by themselves. So I think you probably be okay as long as they stayed moist. You should be all right.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. And we have another question for Lorraine. This one is asking, sorry, I just scrolled past it. I lost it. Lorraine, you know what question you were referring to? It's about the creeping.
Yeah, there was a question from Julianne. Hi, Julianne.
Thank you.
About creeping phlox in a large section of the garden and lawn. And so it's a two-part question. What native plant can I substitute in its place, and how would I best remove the phlox? In my experience, it's actually pretty easy to pull. It's true that you have to this is the thing about pulling up plants that you don't want there and that spread a lot. You have to be like thorough about pulling them out, but they are relatively easy to pull out. I put that in relatively. So that would be the way that I would remove them. And then as far as what I would replace them with, I'm assuming that it's a sunny spot. And I would be putting in some of the native meadow plants, like the really simple, beautiful, like cheerful plants, like the black-eyed Susans and the Coreopsis, and those are the ones that immediately come to mind that aren't too tall. Now, if you wanted to get into taller plants, wow, things like the ironweed and Culver's root and some of the sunflowers. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Do others want to chime in with some suggestions?
I kind of want to jump in on this one, because if I understand the question correctly, you're looking for something to kind of infiltrate and integrate into the lawn, perhaps. And if that is the case, I love that idea, and I've been trying that. I actually have been experimenting with my brother and sister-in-law's lawn, where I planted wild strawberry in the sunny spaces, woodland strawberry in the shadier spaces, and common blue violet in both places. And I put them right at the edge of the beds. So they created a nice little sort of edging plant. And now they're spreading in both directions into the garden and also out into the lawn, which is exactly what I wanted them to do. And I think this should just be the common lawn practice for everyone in the Carolinian zone. So let's get it started, folks.
Yes. Question from Laura. This one is for Ben. What can we do to discourage ticks?
Well, ticks will be around if we have taller vegetation, and if we have things like deer and birds and even dogs to some degree that are moving in our spaces. And some ticks can be on rabbits too. So they really do come on different animal species. And as they're moving further north, they're getting more and more common. And they are concerning because there are a few key diseases that we can get from tick bites if we don't get them soon enough. And so that means that all points to me is prevention. So do your best if you're in longer vegetation to have long pants on that's tucked in really well. Start developing your personal tick radar. And not everybody can do this. It's a bit of a gardening superpower. But I think everybody could, is that you just become really aware of what you're feeling on your skin. And I have been in the field many times and noticed this feeling when I was driving back and when I got home. Certainly do a tick check to check every single spot that you can that's possible, because they are very small and you can't always see them. So if you have a partner or a friend who's like, yeah, sure, I'll do a tick check, you can do it. But the best thing to do is to stay on the path. If you have a garden with longer stuff, if you're doing maintenance in there, for sure be completely aware. There is a spray that you can get, but it's not legal in Canada because it'll probably give you more problems with the toxicity than what the spray is worth. But some of my colleagues I know have come out of projects and they've had 200 ticks on them. So they are increasing in Southern Ontario and other parts of Canada, I know. Yeah, so prevention awareness.
Great, thank you. We have a question now about bees. So this question says that I bring in a few herb planters to overwinter, but then in March they have solitary bees emerging in their house. Are there any suggestions of what to do? Should they let the bees out in March when they emerge? Leave them in your house? What is the best thing to do when you bring your plants in for the winter and they take some wildlife inside with them?
I just want to say I read this question and this is amazing. This is like the coolest thing I've ever heard. And all I can really add is that I have seen in certain actually laboratory experiments where they happen to be doing this on clover. They wanted the clovers to be pollinated and they didn't want to go around and hand pollinate everything. They actually imported some Bombus impatiens, the common bumblebee nests, into the greenhouse, and the bumblebees just very benignly went around and pollinated all those clovers and had just a perfectly fine time inside the greenhouse. I do kind of think that if you've brought it indoors and sort of artificially warmed it so that they're emerging earlier, probably letting them outside, I don't know exactly what would happen with them, but if you're okay with having bumblebees like hanging out in your place for a month or so before it's sort of consistently non-frosty out, I say hang out with them. That's pretty cool if you ask me.
And if you're not comfortable, you can put them in Tupperware in a fridge. At 5 degrees, they'll be okay for a month or so. It's a long time to be confined like that, but if you let them out and there's a frost, it'll kill them. So, yeah.
There's a question here about determining what is a native species that I think is a really good one. It's what is the best resource for keying out a native species? And so maybe we can nerd out for a moment on field guides or best sources to determine. And it depends on how specific you want to get to your area. Like if you want to know, let's say, just for example, if you lived in Toronto, for example, and you wanted to know, hey, is such and such a species native to Toronto? There are sources like the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, or there are kind of lists of plants that are native to the area, or you can use field guides. My favorite one, which will give the location, which will give the geographic range in just general terms. I really love the Peterson Field Guide, very simple to use, but you have to know the color of the flower for it to, that's the first question it asks you. So anyway, what are some of your favorite field guides, fellow panelists?
Okay, I'll go. Well, as a botanist, I go all the way to like the full nerd side of things. So if I really have no idea, I'll go all the way to the flora of North America, which is probably one of the most impressive compendia of botanical knowledge in North America that exists. It's really like a Library of Alexandria type scale of thing. but it's a bit overwhelming for new people. Ontario, unfortunately, doesn't have a full flora, but the Michigan flora, which is all online, is a really wonderful resource, and most of their species are the same. Another one that I really love is from the New England Wildflower Society. Their website is called gobotany.org, I think, and they have a really cool online key. If all of that is a little overwhelming for you, but you don't mind the idea of artificial intelligence taking over the planet, then try iNaturalist, which is surprisingly freakishly good at identifying plants from a photograph. It does frighten me sometimes how good it is, but it does get things wrong, like really wrong sometimes. And if you don't know, then you'll never know. But yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, and I would add, because of the beginning stages when it's really overwhelming, I had a cousin who lived in Atikokan, a beautiful place in northwestern Ontario. He was a really well-known naturalist, and it was the first field guide I ever saw. It was field guide to the plants of the Canadian Shield. And what I like so much about it is that the shield, it goes across Canada. And it's spectacular. There aren't too many invasive non-native species, and there aren't too many species. So when you look through the guide, you kind of think, I can do this. And so this book is so inspiring because it includes a lot of plants for me that were in Southern Ontario, but are still up in the Canadian Shield. And it also had a section on edibles. So any of the guides for me that include, part of the Rockies and part of the Canadian Shield across Canada, they just really, I have a soft spot for that. I think because it was my very first guide that I saw and I had no idea what field guides were. So it was really interesting.
Okay, we did have a question just on that note, asking if there's a field guide that you would recommend that's specific to grasses.
There's a very good book, and I'm not actually sure if it's still in print, but it's called Grasses of Ontario. It's a hardcover book, so it's a reference, but you can also take it out into the field, of course. And it is, as far as I know, it's considered like the reference for Ontario grasses, but other panelists might, it's an older book, other panelists might know of something more recent.
Well, the one that I use, and just so you know, if you're really interested in identifying a grass, like get ready for a journey. You're gonna be in for it. But Grasses of North America is the sort of, again, it's the equivalent of Flora of North America. They just decided not to do grasses and have some other like hyper nerds do the grasses. And it's all in there if you care to dissect out and measure anthers and look for tiny hair tufts at the base of the glooms and all of that. Like, get ready for it. It's a it's a real journey.
Ryan, do we have time for a really short story? I was invited by some botanists to go look at orchids up in the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario. It's spectacular. And we couldn't get out of the parking lot because there were all of these exciting sedges. Sedges are grasses with edges. And I was so bored out of my skull because I didn't know anything botanically. This was in the early 90s that I ended up catching flies that were biting me and feeding them to the pitcher plants. That was my entertainment while these guys identified sedges.
Hey, don't knock the sedges. My plantain leaf sedge on my balcony is my favorite plant that I have right now. It's putting on such a show. Sedges
Take
are great.
all the sedges, Ryan.
Yes. And one of my favorite plants is a sedge as well, and it's called Carex eburnia. Some people call it bristleaf sedge. It is so fantastic, and anyone who is looking for a lawn alternative, you can't mow it, but it gives you the same look. But I guess in these, it's low growing. It is no work whatsoever. You can plant it in shade, and it gets these beautiful little flowers.
I want to know that. I want to know that, like, send that to me. And also Carex pennsylvanicus, beautiful golden cream colored flowers. I was really surprised. So yeah, maybe I could nerd out with you guys and sedges. Who knows?
Well, Carex is the most diverse genus in the temperate region, and every single ecosystem that we have contains probably a dozen species. So if
What
you're
was
trying
that,
to do a,
Ryan?
sorry? Oh, yeah.
What was that, Ryan?
Yeah, yeah, well,
Just kidding.
but
Sorry.
but really, if you want to mimic nature and you don't have any sedges, then you're not doing it right.
But
I'm saying it.
But also the sedge is one of the amazing things that people, I don't think immediately comes to mind when we think of, hey, I want to create habitat for native Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies. These pollinators need sedges as well. Like these are important habitat features. So one of my missions is to get gardeners interested in sedges, the native sedges and native grasses. They're beautiful.
Yeah, someone just asked the name of that sedge again, Lorraine, and
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
So it's Carex eburnia, Eburnia, and some people call it bristle leaf sedge, and it is available in native plant nurseries in Ontario. A couple of them carry it. Yeah, highly recommended. And I think, and the Carex plantaginea is what Ryan mentioned, and then the Carex pennsylvanica Ben mentioned. 3 sedges to start with.
That'll get you started. That'll get you started, okay?
That's awesome. And on that note, as we are nerding out, I would just like to invite everybody to nerd out again with us about plants on Tuesday. We're doing another webinar at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on how you can monitor your garden and contribute to citizen science. So you will see some familiar faces in that webinar on Tuesday. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody so much for joining us today. And we can help wildlife thrive one garden at a time. So have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.